I'm going to strip the whole suspension basically. So I'm removing the control arm, I'm removing the ball joint. Now because of the ball joint, I'm also removing the entire brakes with the bracket and stuff. Because I'm going to remove the spindle or the hub from the car completely. I'm also going to replace the spring seat on the strut assembly, so the strut will come out from the car. I've seen other people don't strip everything, but it's really quite a bit more hassle if you don't remove all the parts, because you'll struggle removing the ball joint and putting back in place. Same for the controllers. And while there, removing the axle from the spindle on some vehicle, this is going to be terribly difficult. Some people even couldn't do it at all, sliding these splines back from the spindle, because there may be a rust or corrosion in there, and the axle may get stuck. That's kind of unfortunate, and you may really check out YouTube for tips to undo this, to remove the axle from the spindle. But if that happens, you may be in trouble. So this is maybe one thing that is better to make sure before starting this job. Just undo the bolt here and try to push it back, see if it moves, tap it a little bit. If you see it's really stuck, maybe you need to think the job again if you really want to do it. If you want to remove the axle from the transmission, I don't need to do it now, but if it happens to be stuck in the spindle, if you want to remove the axle from the transmission, sometimes it's also stuck inside the transmission really bad. So think about this detail before maybe doing the whole job. The handling to the strut. By the way, this was much better if the car has both front wheels off the ground, because if it has just this side of the ground, this will put much pressure and you are going to struggle. Yes, I'm going to undo the bolt 40 millimeters on the axle. I'm going to reuse it, but you should probably get a new one. I'm not going to torque it exactly the maximum torque, but I usually use this one, but you cannot torque it to maximum, right? And I'm going to push back the axle. It's important because I don't want to dislodge the CV joint there. If you pull on the axle, the CV joint might dislodge and you are in big trouble. You probably need to replace the axle. I'm going to undo this ABS sensor, removing the nut on the end link from the anti-roll bar or sway bar. It's perhaps the trickiest part when you remove the struts on this Volvo S60. This nut is most often time very stuck in there, and also mechanics will tighten it very strongly. One of the first thing I will do is just clean a bit the threads here, just in front. Make sure they are really clean. Get a good brush, clean them off. Then I will use the nut. Normally it's an 18mm one. I will use a 1/2 inch ratchet with the 18mm nut on it and a good extension. This is a 2-feet bar, and I will just first place the socket over the nut, and then you see I'm using an extension. The extension is really helpful because you need to make place for the bar in order to be able to extend it, to use it. So you really need to match it somewhere underneath the car. Depends on the side of the car you're working. This side, for example, goes like that, and the other side you will need to position it somehow towards the front of the car. So you may find a place, and you don't have enough. You really just don't have much play to move the bar, but it should be quite enough. So going like this, I will just break the nut loose at the first, and always use this bar. Never use the Torx from the beginning. And as soon as I see the nut starts to rotate, we'll probably rotate with the ball joint along, but that's not a problem. That's just the first step. Then the next step, is to get the ratchet with the Torx. I use on this Volvo original end links, it's a 40 Torx T40. You definitely need to have a good torque set. Don't buy a cheap one on this car, you will just break it right away. Get the best quality Torx set sockets you can find. It's very important on this car. So again, I'll just put the ratchet on it like this, and then I grab the 18mm wrench, and you just grab it with a second wrench like this. Probably you'll see this too. The mechanics will do this. This really works very well because you don't have much place to put enough torque. And then from there, from this point, you should be able to break loose the bolt. If not to break loose, but just to undo it from there. If you really don't manage to undo the bolt, there is no other way. Just get the grinder, cut the nut, and replace the end link. Just another word on this upper nut, this upper end of the end link uses a larger T40 Torx. The lower one, for some reason Volvo put even a smaller, I think it's a T30, and that one, that's really hard to undo, if not impossible. So forget about that one. Try to disconnect the upper one. So if you happen to have no choice but the cut is here, the nut, you'll just need to grind the nut at the bottom and replace the whole end link. What I suggest to do is always use a pry bar like this and insert it. Let me just grab the light. Insert it underneath the over the sway bar, anti-roll bar, underneath the control arm or the subframe, and just push downwards like this. Will place this end link and will position it. Needs to be loosened up with the 80mm socket first, and then once it turns a little bit, just place a 80mm wrench on it, and you need to keep the tip from turning. And I got the an 8mm wrench like this to fit in there, or maybe just grab some adjustable wrench and loosen up. So I'm going to undo the two bolts on the strut. You notice there is a adjustment for the geometry. It's the camber adjustment. If you see here, right at this very part, there is some play. I would say it's about 3mm play, so 1/4 of an inch. It's very small, so it's better maybe to measure, just get a measure of this the part of the metal that protrudes here, so before you undo the bolts. You see, this is the well at the top with I think this is the most negative camber, and if I push it at the top, this is the most positive camber. And personally, I always set it like this before tightening, so I just keep my hand here and I tighten the bolt, and it stays like this. So this is just my setting. I never had issues with uneven tire wear or something like that. And by the way, if you need to undo this, I usually use an 80mm wrench on this side, on the bolt side. You see the bolt goes like this towards the rear of the car. This is the new nut on the left side. So I use an 80mm wrench, and to undo the nut I will use a 1/2 inch ratchet with an extension, and this is a 13/16 Imperial socket. I am using an Imperial socket. I'm not sure what's the millimeter size, but the Imperial 13/16, and you may of course need an extension bar. This is a 2-feet bar to break loose and to tighten back the bolts here. And again, the adjustment is really just at the top. The bottom doesn't have play, it's just the upper bolt that has a play. You can see the play again. Again, for the ABS sensor, I just removed the small bolt, and then if I look underneath, just above of the CV joint, this part here is the tip of the ABS sensor, so I'm just inserting this flat screwdriver like this just underneath, and I'm prying up a little bit gently. You can see already it has moved up, and now I can remove it from there, just like that. So don't force on the wire again. Now the whole caliper is out, so I need actually to remove the caliper because I have the line, the brake line here, so I need to completely remove the spindle from the car, the hub. It must come out completely so I can punch out the ball joint, but that's just for the ball joint thing. And I also, you don't need to remove it if you just undo the control arm right there. And I'm going to toss the CV axle to remove it from the spindle as well. I'm also replacing the ball joint. For this I'll just grab it. First, it has a Torx screw here, a Torx socket. You need to clean it very nicely with a small screwdriver, something. Just make sure it's clean so the socket gets in there very easily. But before putting the socket on the Torx socket on it, I will just break it loose with an 18 millimeters with a better ½ inch ratchet. So put the ratchet on it first with a socket and pull it, turn it a little bit, break it loose a little bit. It will turn, and also it will turn inside the control arm. This breaks loose the seat here inside, just to see it turning, and then stop. Just like that. And then I have to use a 18 millimeter ratchet, 18 millimeter wrench on it. I'll grab it with a second one, just like this. I'll grab with a second wrench and keep the Torx from turning with a T40, I think, and just undo the nut. But the nut might be difficult to undo like this. Make sure you clean it pretty nicely, all the threads, and put some penetrating oil before working on it, because sometimes it's really hard to undo. Make sure you don't slip the T40 in there, because if it slips, you are pretty much done. You need to cut the nut. With a spindle out of the car, I suggest attaching the axle with a wire on the brackets here. That's the brake pads bracket, just so it doesn't hang in the air. It's important to take care of the CV joint so it doesn't dismantle itself. I forgot now, but it's better to undo these 2 bolts, at least get them loose while the spindle is still on the car, because you just don't want to mess when the spindle is out. So maybe do this first along with the ball joint, undo them. So at this point I'm going to proceed with removing the control arm, doing completely the bolts, and toss it away from the car. I want to remove the control arm from the car. I want to replace the rear bushing. So for this thing, I'm just first starting with the nut. For the rear, I'll use an 18 millimeter to hold the nut. Careful not to put it against the end link, because it's gonna bend the end link. Careful with that thing. And I'm using a ½ inch ratchet. It's important because the nut is really tight, and I'm going to put a, if you can see, it's 13 on 16 imperial. This fits really nice. And I'll use a breaker bar. It's a 2 feet long bar over the ratchet. Just before working on the bolt, I just use some steel wire and just wanted to clean the threads pretty nice, and then when I remove the bolt, I'll just clean again the threads. Really makes the job much easier to remove those bolts. Underneath the car, I will just place the bottle jack like this with a piece of wood under the transmission, so nothing metal against the transmission, just the wood, something. I need to clear these bolts here. Mine are not original ones. This is a 15, a 17, so yours might differ, might be the same or both the same or a different size. And I will work with a 3/8 of an inch ratchet. My half an inch ratchet won't fit in there no matter what, so I will just work with this is a good quality one, so it's strong enough to undo those bolts. But you can see it doesn't fit in there at mostly both of bolts, so I will need to jack a little bit transmission, not much. I would say about probably half an inch. I'm not forcing on it, so this should be pretty much good. Just grab the socket from there. So as you can see, at this point the socket fits nicely. I'm not going to remove the bolt from there with just the socket. So what I'm going to do is just I will undo both bolts at the same time, more or less, and that will push it will push the control arm out. And if when you remove the control arm from there, you may remove the bolts by hand, not with the socket, but by hand. They should fit out, they should come out easily. If you need to remove them, maybe it's good to check the bolts, because these bolts are going against the subframe, and sometimes I found one was really rusted, so maybe check them carefully, they have a coat on them. With the bolts, both bolts slack a little bit, I'll just lower the transmission. I don't want to keep the engine jacked up, maybe it's forcing on the engine mount, so I don't need this for now. I'll just lower it. Now for the ball joint, bolts are out. I'll just grab my chisel and keep it like this at an angle on both sides, and kick it with a hammer, kick it pretty strong. And also try to alternate. I will kick it here, right here at the edge, along this line. I will just punch it there. Hopefully it's gonna come out. And needs to be kicked with some optimism. This is also a good moment to check the wheel bearing. It should turn smooth and not too easy. It should feel a little bit of forcing when turning. This means it's good, and you should feel no roughness, no spots while turning it. I'm also checking the ball joint. The ball joint sits a little bit at an angle like this inside the car. You see this one, it's kind of hard. I mean, it's still pretty tight if I keep it straight like that, but if I move it to the angle of the correct position inside the car, then it's kind of not too hard to move. So when it's easy to move, or worse, if you feel any kind of play, it's time to replace it. This side seems to be coming out pretty nicely, but again, if you feel like it doesn't move, if you punch it there, don't punch it on near the bolts, just punch it right there at the edge here. If you feel it doesn't move, you see this one already has a small gap. If you feel it doesn't move, get the scissor into right in there. Don't be afraid to punch along the line like this. So now it's coming out pretty nicely. And you see very easily why these are hard to remove. It's because there's a lot of corrosion in it. This seems to be original, and by the way, if you recognize the stamp, that means this is a limb folder. The small triangle there, it's a limb folder, and I strongly recommend get a limb folder for replacement part. Don't put something else, because you'll have a big problem pushing that back in. And notice how corroded it is in there, so we need to be cleaned up really nicely here. I'm gonna put a brush, wire brush on it, and I'm gonna use grease, high pressure grease, the one that goes for the CV boats. Again, use a limb folder, is the best quality. Don't never buy $7-8 ball joint for this car. Please get a link for that instead. Let's see, I give numbers, but it's a link for that. That's pretty much this is the original furniture for Volvo. So actually, when you see Volvo stamped somewhere, it's just that link for the gave that to Volvo, and Volvo put the Volvo stamp on it. It is a good idea to put the new ball joint inside into the freezer overnight, so the metal will shrink and you're going to press it back in place much easier. So just overnight into the freezer. I didn't go this way with mine, I forgot, but I'm just saying. So when you're inserting this thing, you need to check the holes are aligned with the ball joint, because the thing you see it has splines, so it may just rotate like this a little bit. You need to match the splines. You just feel it by hand, but you really need to not to punch it in this way, because the holes won't align. You may you may just want to insert a little bit the bolts in there to make sure the hole align, and then punch the thing punch it in. And now to punch it in, I just got this from hardware store. It's a big coupler. It's a plumber stuff. I'm not sure the size of it, but maybe just go to the store and search if you find one big enough. So this one goes just, you see, it goes just past the rubber boot of the ball joint, so it won't kick the rubber board, it won't crush it. And then I'm gonna kick on this with a hammer and type it back in place. Tips to safely compress your coil springs. So always use a quality spring compressor. These are not welded here, it's just one piece. Always use two of them. Try to put them in really opposite side, so they face each other, both on the top and on the bottom. One nice tip is try to put them sideways, like you see here. This is more to the left, to the right, and the rod is kind of perpendicular to the coils here, right? Makes a 90-degree angle. Always compress them both. I usually do 2 turns, maybe one side, 2 turns the other side, and so on until it's fully properly compressed. So always compress each side at a time. Alternate the sides. And you don't need to have the coils at the end close to each other. That's probably because the coil spring has enormous tension in it, so you don't need to compress it like crazy. Just compress it until you see this spring seat here starts to move freely. I think that's about it. Very last tip, on many cars this nut is what keeps the whole spring tension in there. So you never remove this nut without having the spring compressed and the spring seat getting a little bit loose. Then you remove it. On other cars there's another nut inside, a securing nut, but don't take any chance, because the coil spring pressure it's tremendous. There are many people, if you check, just Google up coil spring compressor accident, you'll see what I'm talking about. So it's the last one, it's being removed there. Compressor to fail. Just a few words about the this particular Volvo stuff. So the main problems with Volvo here, the strut itself lasts about 100,000 miles or even less than that, but the main problem is the spring seat here, the rubber part. Here's my replacement part. It said everywhere on the forums, you don't want to do this job twice and don't want to spend the money twice. It's weird, but most of the aftermarket coil spring seats don't last more than 6 months to 1 year. It's really that short, and I'm saying really most of them. The replacement, you have the Volvo option at the main dealer, you have the Such option, and then this is the unofficial replacement part in It's made in France box. You'll find them, I found it on Euro Parts, and they said this is a part that's been sold like this, like an aftermarket part, but actually this is the original part that Volvo, if you bring it to the main dealer, Volvo will put this on your car, this specific part. So go either with the original part sold by the dealer or sold in boxes like this, either with such. Now my coil spring is compressed enough, the spring seat it's moving freely, and I've removed the knot here. You notice the cross shape securing knot here. Notice the way it sits. It sits with this cross pattern upwards, right? And now you need to release it. You still use Torx to keep it from rotating. I don't have it, so this is enough to remove it. Now it's kind of loose. You won't be able to tighten that much this one, not because it sits against the rubber, but still